My colleagues, John Picton and John Tribe, pass on their apologies, so they're unable to share this experience with us today. But I do thank everyone for being in the room, and of course the Open University legal team for putting on this opportunity. So as soon as I saw the call for papers, I was very excited. So I just repeated that call for papers. I noticed some presenters have. The unexpected places. And so looking at archival, theoretical, interdisciplinary, and I'm just thinking this is an amazing challenge. So my background comes, basically corporate law, and looking in particular at the modern slavery disclosure regime that's now imposed on, all sorts of enterprises, but companies predominantly. And my wonderful co-authors are John's, have also expertise in company, in insolvency, charities, and misconduct. So we did a bit of brainstorming and put our heads together. And one of this came about really because of the SLS, because of the Society of Legal Scholars actually brought us together in all sorts of ways, intellectually and also, in physical proximity to each other, to attend conferences and to have these discussions. And one of the discussion came about around this backlash against commemorating industrialists linked to slavery. And so, of course, that takes us, if I had to call this the diversion, the Bristol diversion, to our time we had recently in Bristol. And I'd already been thinking about, from my background in the modern slavery, and also having gone to Liverpool, there's the famous Slavery Museum in Liverpool. And then we go to Bristol, and of course that background around the historical use of slavery to fund, great enterprises. And the Wills Tower, so most of these photos are photos that I took, so they're a bit hokey. So the Wills Tower, where we were at the conference, the toppled statue of the Edward Colston, and then just next door in the Wills Tower is the actual university's museum. And so mention there of the Black Lives Matter movement. That is at the heart, the societal a movement that is at the heart of some of it, what it is that what's going to talk about. So what I've got here then is a work in progress. And so what I'm trying to reconcile is particularly, I guess, in the UK, the charity sector, it's very deep, very long-standing charity sector, as well as, of course, for-profit enterprises. So what I'm trying to do then is to reconcile some of these the wealth effects, I guess, of the economics, about reconcile that great wealth was drawn from circumstances of fairly horrific human rights abuses, but yet there was still this painted picture of Edward Colston, one of the most virtuous and wise sons of Bristol, for example. How do we reconcile all of that? And how then we reconcile the modern iterations of those families, the family wealth, how we see that translated into modern corporations, and then how we see that into the charitable foundations. So how we as institutions, as companies, as for-profit entities, as entrepreneurs, how are we all as a society dealing with acknowledging these horrific crimes of the past? So it takes me to Sunlight Village. So my co-author, John Tribe, very kindly then took me to the Sunlight Village. I'd never been there before. And in that coalesced, the whole idea then is, well, why don't we focus on Unilever, a global company, famous in the UK for its products, its longevity, and also very famous, as I was to discover, about the Port Sunlight Village. And so very much that at the heart of Lord Leverhulme there, as sort of his reputation as a great benefactor, using his wealth for societal good, and how this contrasts amazingly then when you go to the background of the supply chain of Unilever and the products they manufactured. And this is then the story that's actually in one of the museums there at the Sunlight Village. There's this sort of nod here. We see that the plantations relied on forced labour. Lever's business activities in the Belgian Congo cannot be ignored, and we're working to uncover the truth. So that's really the acknowledgement that exists, and that exists at the museum, which is run by Trust, which is at the charitable end of what we're looking at. So just to give a bit of context around the law, also when we talk about financial scandals and insolvency, I mentioned a little bit about, and there will be in the paper, some background to the charity sector in the UK, and that's John's expertise, John Tribe, and this is just showing a very recent article he published in The Conversation, getting to the bottom of the charity abuses and scandals that we continue to experience in the UK. So if we look at the UK sector, as I said, the interconnection between the for-profit companies, so Unilever to me provides a great example of that. Clear antecedents back to the Lever brothers, who incorporated in the late 19th century, and then we can follow the trajectory, the business trajectory of that company, and we can follow the business trajectory of that company and to its corporate activities in the Congo in relation to the human rights abuses there. So Unilever has a charitable arm, Unilever Foundation, as well as its indirect charitable arms. So they may not be formally affiliated with Unilever, the company today, but there's, of course, the Lever Foundation, Port Sunlight Village itself, and the Lady Lever Art Gallery that sits within the Port Sunlight Village, but is under the auspices of the National Museums Liverpool. So some fairly, amazing enterprises and institutions there. So if we look at slavery and legislation, the background, well, of course, there's historical legislation, but also my interest is in the modern legislation, so the Modern Slavery Act. And then, of course, we have the corporate reports around the Modern Slavery Act, so the connection with Unilever and reporting on its modern slavery, identification of risks and management of risks. I also a nod there, so it's a fairly horrific topic, but a nod there to Jules Marshall's book that I have read, and it is the only image I've put up there. I took a photo of the book, so we do have a sense of the portrayal then of the conditions that were happening in the Congo in the beginning of the 20th century. So putting that history together with what we might think of as a modern iteration of that from the corporate side, from the modern slavery statement. So this is also then Unilever itself has history and archives. So this is just a snapshot of their website. And so Unilever has art, archives, and records management. And very much you can see it is about portraying the images and the history of the products. So there's still not a lot there when we look at the history and archives about the foray into the Congo. And then one of the perhaps more benign episodes is this 1950s series of books by Charles Wilson, which are history. So that's actually a shot that John Tribe took. So as soon as we started working on the project, John's amazing, and he ordered that 2-volume set of the Charles Wilson history on history of Unilever. So he's reading that. I've read the Marshall book, and we'll see there's a few other sources. So what we're going to do is apply a case study approach from the sort of the qualitative research approach. It's quite legitimate to have a case study that looks at one organisation, because then we look at that one organisation at the centre, and then we look at the other peripheral organisations. So we can look at the case study document, and from that, for an example, if we're looking at the peripheral organisations, we've got the Port Sunlight Trust there, and we see a bit of a nod there in that document there. It's called their newsletter. So it was called Racism and the Belgian Congo and William Lever. So it still doesn't really use the word slavery as such. And if we think, well, this is all history, what is a company meant to do in its modern iteration in relation to that past history? Well, you'll see there's an example I've got from the OECD on this part of the slide. There's actually a group of former workers associated with Unilever activities and operations have filed a complaint quite recently in 2018, and that complaint still hasn't been resolved. So we still have these issues from the corporate side. So in terms of analysing the documents, I want to look at the documentary sources about Unilever. So Unilever is the corporation itself. So we've got the modern slavery statement, its annual reports, its sustainability reports, but then also the charities. So those charities that are affiliated either directly or indirectly with Unilever or the Unilever history, also have a look at those charities' annual reports, because of course charities are required to file reports. There's then various historical accounts. So it won't be necessary to read all of these, but most of these in panel B I've got there on the slide, they're mostly books. And so we're focusing on the Marshall book, the third one, and the fourth one, the Wilson History of Unilever. We'll see this material still is quite resonant because we see the BBC Great Lives did a podcast quite recently about Lord Leverhulme. So there's a lot of interest still in Unilever and the Lever brothers and connecting the dots, if you like. It's a lot harder, hence the question I asked some of the presenters earlier. It's a little bit harder actually to find scholarly works that are quite relevant or directly relevant in this area. So scholarly works, I mean like journal articles as opposed to these books. And then, of course, any sort of NGO documents we can find about Unilever's performance in the human rights space, particularly linking to modern slavery and to slavery. So these might be my data sources. And so you're probably saying, well, what am I looking for? So what I'm looking for is, I'm just going to flip next screen. So since submitting the abstract that was kindly accepted, I had a bit of a think about, so if we're going to look at the sources, what are we looking for? So yes, it is that narrative about slavery, but I want to look at this under this theoretical lens of the theory of atonement. And so it tends to come from communication theory, and what we're looking for is the rhetorical stance, particularly from companies, but also from the charities, looking at how they acknowledge and seek. So the misconduct we're talking about here is their historical slavery antecedents. How do they acknowledge and seek forgiveness? And importantly, what's the proposed restoration or reparation of those relationships? So this resonates very particularly in for example, in the Australian context, because we do talk a lot and agonise a lot in the political public discourse about issues of apologies and reconciliation with our Indigenous people. So, that's a different story. But it struck me that this concept, this theory of atonement, is also something to help me when we're looking through the sources, the historical documents, in creating this narrative about Unilever's quite unsavoury past with the forced labour and slavery in the Congo. So what are the preliminary findings? I just flick back to the slide. So the modern slavery statement doesn't refer to historical slavery, or in talking about identifying slavery risks and reparations, there's no mention at all in the modern slavery about any sort of historical slavery impact. The charity reporting, okay, so far it's really, when we look at the types of organisations involved, so far it's only the actual Liverpool museums who make a specific reference to the history of slavery. And so one of the things that we're looking at then is this, to make a commentary around the need for improved disclosure rules. So whether this is in the corporate sphere and directly dealing with the Modern Slavery Act, or whether this comes back as an opportunity to inform some of the narrative that could be with the charity standards. Because we know, particularly when we look at, and got my map in my mind of the island, if we look sort of trace from Scotland and we traced round to the west coast, we know, for example, many public institutions like universities are grappling with these issues now about how their current activities are funded from the proceeds of past slavery. So that's two of the aims that we're looking at about, is there any way that we can use this material, using the case study from Unilever, to try and inform the need for improved disclosure rules, either at the corporate level, so to speak, or at the charity standard level. Okay, so I think that's just about my time up. So in the takeaways for the case study then, just to run through a couple of points then, is to look at, the case study is going to look at the Unilever, its charitable arms and its direct arms and indirect arms, so to speak, and the historical connections to slavery. And what I'm doing this is under the theoretical lens of atonement. And so it will explore the importance of that confession, recognition, and the need to make reparation. The historical context. So the historical context comes alive for us, I think, because there has been such a contemporary backlash against commemorating those figures, who amassed wealth through colonialisation and exploitation, including slavery. We have modern charitable foundations. It would appear that once these enterprises amass this wealth, then they try have set up these foundations to give this wealth away. And so, in more contemporary times, how can we reconcile those three major aspects, the wealth generation into foundations aligned with the modern corporation?